My name is Sarah Mather. I am 34 years old. And the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible inside your own family, I was 11 years old, standing in the doorway of our kitchen in a school uniform, holding a science trophy I had just won. My sister Priya was sitting at the dining table. My mother was braiding Priya's hair and laughing at something Priya had said. My father was reading the newspaper, occasionally glancing up to smile at Priya, the way fathers smile at children they are genuinely proud of. I stood there for a full minute. Nobody turned around. I eventually set the trophy on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and went to my room. The trophy sat on that counter for 3 days before my mother moved it to the back of a shelf without mentioning it. I want to be honest with you. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody shouted at me. Nobody told me I was worthless. What happened to me was quieter than that. And in many ways, the quietness made it harder to explain. Harder even to admit to myself for a very long time. My family didn't hate me. I genuinely believe that. What they did was something more subtle. They simply directed their love, their attention, their resources, and their hope entirely toward Priya. And they left just enough warmth in my direction to ensure I never had the language to describe what was happening. Priya was the older daughter by 3 years. She was bright in the way that made teachers call my parents and say, "Your daughter is exceptional." She was charming in the way that made every relative pull her in for a long hug and say what a beautiful girl. She had the kind of smile that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. I was quieter, more serious. I didn't perform well at the things that drew applause. I was not funny at family dinners. I was not fashionable at weddings. I was not effortlessly social at parties. What I had always been, was precise, careful, determined. Those qualities, in my family, went almost entirely unnoticed. By the time Priya and I were teenagers, the pattern had calcified into something permanent. Priya's school functions were attended with cameras and freshly ironed clothes. Mine were attended, when they were attended, with the distracted energy of people who had somewhere better to be. Priya's birthdays were events. Mine were meals, sometimes. I am not telling you this to make you pity me. I am telling you this so that you understand what I built my life on top of. Because everything that happened later, every single piece of it, grew directly from that foundation. When I told my parents at 17 that I wanted to study medicine, my father looked at me over his newspaper and said, "That's a long road, Sarah. Are you sure you have the stamina for it?" He asked Priya the same year what she wanted to do. She said she wanted to study fashion communication. He said, "That sounds exciting. Let's look at the best colleges." I got into a government medical college on a merit scholarship. Priya got a private college paid for in full by my parents, including the hostel, the laptop, the monthly allowance, and the study trip to Mumbai my parents funded when Priya said the exposure was important for her career. I worked part-time in my second year to cover my own textbooks. I want you to notice something. I am not telling you that Priya was a bad person. She was not then. She was simply a person who had been given so much for so long that she had completely lost the ability to see it. When you grow up being told the world will arrange itself for you, you believe it. You stop being able to imagine a different version of the story. The gap between Priya's life and my life grew wider every year. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of the slow accumulation of 1,000 small choices my parents made. 1,000 small moments where they said, without words, Priya matters more. I graduated from medical college with honors. I specialized in critical care nursing. The ICU, the emergency ward, the spaces where people arrive broken and either leave healed or don't leave at all. It is precise, exhausting, and deeply demanding work. It requires the kind of focus that leaves no room for pretending. My parents attended my graduation. They sat in the third row and took one photograph. In the photograph, my mother is looking slightly to the left of the camera. Priya did not come. She said she had a client presentation that day. My mother said, "We completely understand, Priya. Sarah will have other graduations." I did not have other graduations. I moved to a city 6 hours from home, and I began building a life that had nothing to do with being noticed. I found an apartment with a balcony where I could sit in the early morning before my shifts. I found colleagues who became friends. Neha, who had the darkest sense of humor I had ever encountered in a person, and Dr. Alok, who had been working in the ICU for 20 years and still got quietly emotional when a patient recovered against the odds. I worked hard, not to prove anything to my family anymore. I had given up on that project long before. I worked hard because it was the one thing I knew how to do completely, and because in the ICU, hard work had a direct and visible result. A patient who came in unconscious and left walking. A family who had been sitting in the corridor for days, afraid to hope, suddenly crying in relief. In the real world, in the world of my family, hard work disappeared quietly into the background. In the ICU, it mattered. I could see it mattering. I called home once a week, on Sunday mornings. The calls were usually 15 minutes. My mother would tell me what Priya was doing. A new project, a new client, a new trip. My father would make a comment about how I should eat properly. Then someone would say, "Take care," and we would hang up. I stopped mentioning my own life in those calls around year 3. Nobody asked. This is the part of the story where I need to tell you about Grandma Kamla. Grandma Kamla was my father's mother. She was 78 years old, had survived a husband who left early, raised 2 sons on a school teacher's salary, and had the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't announce itself but fills a room anyway. She was the only person in my family who called me on my birthday without being reminded. She was the only person who, when I told her about a difficult case at work, a child, 7 years old, who had come in after an accident and spent 3 weeks in the ICU, listened for a full hour and said, at the end, "You were there with him, Sarah. That matters. You were there." I visited Grandma Kamla twice a year. I stayed in her small apartment and slept on the fold-out sofa and ate the food she cooked. And we talked, really talked, about her life and my life and what we both thought about the world. She never once said, "How is Priya doing?" in a way that suggested Priya was the real subject of the conversation. She asked about me. About a year before everything happened, Grandma Kamla called me on a Tuesday afternoon, not my usual Sunday call, a Tuesday, and said she needed to tell me something. She said she had been putting some things in order. She said she had made arrangements that she wanted me to know about. And then she said something that I wrote down in my notebook because I knew I would need to hold on to it. She said, "Sarah, being invisible doesn't mean you're not seen. I have always seen you, and I have tried, in the only way I could, to make sure you know that." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You'll understand when the time comes. I just needed you to know, before the time comes, that it was done on purpose, with love, not as an afterthought." I didn't fully understand what she was telling me. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me. We hung up. 3 months later, Grandma Kamla passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 78 years old, and she had been, for the entirety of my adult life, the only unconditional warmth I received from my family's direction. I am not going to describe that grief to you in detail, because some things don't translate into words cleanly. I will just say that I sat in the parking lot of the hospital after I got the call, and I did not go inside for 45 minutes. And when I finally went in, I worked a full 12-hour shift, because that is what I do with things I cannot carry standing still. I have to pause here and tell you something before I go further. If you are watching this right now and you have someone in your life, one person, maybe someone everyone else overlooks, maybe someone who doesn't make a lot of noise, who has quietly, consistently showed up for you, please tell them today, not tomorrow. And if you are finding this story because you know what it feels like to be the one in the background, the reliable one, the invisible one, I want you to know I see you. This story is for you. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories I tell here are exactly for people like us. Now, back to what happened. The will reading was scheduled for a Saturday, 3 weeks after the funeral. My father and his brother, my uncle Devraj, were the executors. Priya came. My mother came. I drove 6 hours and arrived the night before, staying in a hotel because my parents' house was already full with relatives I hadn't seen in years. The lawyer was a precise, silver-haired man named Mr. Anand. He had the energy of someone who had sat in many difficult rooms and learned to remain perfectly neutral regardless of what was happening in them. He began with the expected items. The apartment. The jewelry. Small amounts distributed among the grandchildren. Standard provisions. My father nodded throughout. My mother dabbed at her eyes. Priya sat next to my mother and held her hand. And then Mr. Anand said, "There is one additional provision." He reached into his briefcase and produced an envelope. Not the main folder, a separate envelope. White. Sealed. With my name written on the front in Grandma Kamla's handwriting. My mother looked at it. My father looked at it. Priya looked at it. Mr. Anand said, "Mrs. Kamla Mathur left specific instructions that this envelope be opened and read aloud in the presence of the full family at the time of the will reading. This was her explicit written request, witnessed and notarized. The room went very quiet. Mr. Anand opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things, a letter, handwritten, and a document, official, stamped, from a bank, that he held up briefly before placing on the table. He began to read. And I'm going to tell you exactly what Grandma Kamla wrote, word for word, because I have read it so many times since that day that I could recite it in my sleep. She wrote, "To my family, gathered here because I have gone, and because I was always better at saying things on paper than out loud. I have watched this family for many years. I have watched with love, and I have also watched with sadness. Because one of my granddaughters has been, for most of her life, asked to make herself small so that the room would feel comfortable for everyone else. I have tried to speak about this. I was told I was imagining things. I was told Sarah was independent and didn't need as much. I was told that Sarah preferred it that way. Sarah, I want you to know, in front of everyone, that I never believed that. Not for one day. You earned a merit scholarship when Priya's private college was paid in full. You worked part-time for textbooks when Priya had a monthly allowance. You drove 6 hours alone to visit me when Priya's visits required a flight to be booked for her. I noticed. I could not change what your parents did, but I could do one thing. For the past 14 years, I have been putting aside money every month. Not much. What a retired school teacher can manage. I put it in a fixed account in your name alone, Sarah, because I was afraid if I told anyone, someone would find a reason why it should be distributed fairly. There is nothing fair about what has already happened to you. So I decided to be deliberately unfair in the other direction. The amount, as of this month, is 11,42,000 rupees. It is yours, fully, already transferred. The account details are in the document beside this letter. I am not asking the family to agree. I am not asking for a discussion. This is done. And I want to say one more thing to everyone in this room. Sarah became a critical care nurse. She works in an ICU. She has spent 14 years learning to keep people alive in their worst moments. That is not just a nurse. That is someone who chose every single day to show up for strangers the way her own family never showed up for her. I am proud of you, Sarah. I should have said it louder, more often. Consider this me saying it as loudly as I can from the only place I have left. With all of my love, Dadi Kamla. Mr. Anand set the letter down. The room was completely silent. I was looking at the table. I did not trust myself to look at anyone else. After a moment, I looked up. My mother's face had gone the color of old paper. My father had one hand pressed flat against the table, as if he needed to steady himself. Priya was staring at her lap. Nobody said anything for a very long time. And then my uncle Devraj, who had not spoken much through the entire reading, cleared his throat and said, quietly, "She always was the sharpest one in the family." He wasn't talking about Priya. I want to tell you about what happened after. But first, the moment I haven't told you yet. The moment that, in some ways, changed everything even before the will reading. 6 weeks before that Saturday, before Grandma Kamla passed, before any of this. My father had a cardiac event. It happened on a Thursday evening at my parents' house. He was 64 years old. He had been having mild chest discomfort for 2 days that he had dismissed as acidity, the way men of his generation dismiss things. And then, during dinner, he went pale and his breathing changed, and my mother called me in a panic because I was, by pure coincidence, by the chance of a family birthday 2 days earlier, the only person in the house. I am a critical care nurse. I have spent 14 years in ICUs. I have seen cardiac events more times than I can count. I knew what I was looking at. I got him to the floor. I called the ambulance. I monitored his pulse and his breathing. I talked to him steadily the entire time, keeping him calm, keeping him present, watching for the signs that things were about to get worse. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive. In those 11 minutes, my father looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. And he said, his voice unsteady, "You know what you're doing." It wasn't a question. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. The way you recognize something that was always there and realize you somehow never properly seen it. "Yes," I said, "I do." He was in the hospital for 4 days. Priya arrived on day 2 from her city with flowers and a new kurta and the energy of someone who had rushed here from somewhere important. She sat with my mother and cried beautifully, and the nurses on the ward recognized her as the devoted daughter. I sat in the corridor and answered questions from the attending cardiologist about my father's history, his symptoms, the exact timeline of the 11 minutes before the ambulance. The cardiologist told me my assessment had been precise and that it had likely made a significant difference. Nobody in my family heard that conversation. Priya left on day 3. She said she had a deadline. My mother said, "Of course, Betai. You've already done so much." I stayed for day 4. I drove 6 hours home in the dark. My father called me the following Sunday. Not my mother, my father, which had never happened before. He said, "Sarah, I want to say something. I've been thinking about it all week and I want to say it properly." I said, "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I don't think I ever told you. Not really. How proud I am of what you've become, of what you do. I think I didn't fully understand it. and I think I should have tried harder to understand. It was not a perfect apology. It did not undo 15 years. It did not explain the laptop they bought Priya and the textbooks I paid for myself. It was not enough, but it was real. It was the first real thing he had said to me in a very long time. I said, "Thank you, Papa. I know." We didn't say much more after that, but something had shifted. Quietly, the way things shift in this family. Not with announcements, but with small, barely visible changes in the atmosphere. 3 weeks later, Grandma Kamla was gone, and then came the Saturday. The lawyer's office. The second envelope. Now, back to the room. After Mr. Anand finished reading, my mother found her voice first. And I want to be fair to her when I tell you what she said, because it was not what I expected. She did not argue. She did not say the money should be split. She did not reach for her usual language of fairness disguised as erasure. She said, her voice very quiet, "Kamla always did see things more clearly than the rest of us." Priya looked up from her lap. Her eyes were red. She said, looking at me, really at me, "I didn't know, Sarah, about the textbooks, about a lot of it. I didn't know." I believed her. That's the thing about growing up as the golden child. You're so completely inside the warmth that you genuinely don't feel the temperature drop a few feet away. Priya had not been cruel to me. She had simply been, like all of us, shaped by the world she grew up in. "I know," I said. "That's the saddest part." Uncle Devraj drove me to my hotel afterward. He said, at the door, "Your daddy spent 14 years quietly making sure that someday you would have something that was only yours. That's not nothing, Sarah." "No," I said, "it isn't." I sat in my hotel room that evening and I opened the bank document. I read the numbers. 11,42,000 rupees. Not a fortune, not a lottery. Enough to matter. Enough to be proof of something that mattered far more than the money itself. The proof that someone had seen me. Consistently. For 14 years. Quietly, the way I had learned to be quiet. But deliberately. The way she said. Deliberately and with love. I cried then. Not from sadness. From something that doesn't have a clean name. Relief, maybe, and grief. And a kind of retroactive warmth that reached back through years and touched all the cold places. I let myself cry for a while. Then I washed my face. Then I opened my phone and booked my drive home for the next morning. I want to tell you what my life looks like now. The 11 lakh became the down payment on a small flat in my city. Not a grand gesture, not a performance, just a home that is mine. My name on the deed, my choice of curtains. A balcony where I sit in the early morning before my shifts, the same as before, except now it is a balcony I own. My father and I talk more often than we used to. Not perfectly. Not without the awkward weight of everything that was left unsaid for too long. But more. He asks about my work now. Actually asks, and listens to the answer. My mother is making her own quiet adjustments. It is slow. I am patient with it. Not because I owe her patience, but because I have stopped spending energy on anger that serves nothing. Priya and I text sometimes. She sent me a message last month that said, "I've been thinking about a lot of things. I think I was given too much for too long and I didn't question it enough. I'm sorry." It was not a complete sentence. Healing rarely is. I wrote back, "I know. Let's keep talking. I am still a nurse. I still work in the ICU." Last week, a patient came in. A woman in her 60s, unconscious, brought in by her daughter, who was so afraid she could barely speak. We stabilized her. After 2 days, she was sitting up. The daughter came to find me in the corridor. She held both my hands and said, "You were there. Every time I looked in, you were there." I thought of Grandma Kamla. I said, "That's the job." But it is more than the job. It is who I am. The person who shows up. The person who stays. The person who notices. It took me a long time to understand that those qualities, the ones my family had spent years treating as furniture, as background, as convenient, were not my weakness. They were my entire foundation. Grandma Kamla knew it when I was 11 years old with a science trophy and a glass of water in my own kitchen. She saw me then. She sees me still. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. I mean that genuinely. You stayed with me through something that took me many years to fully understand, and you gave it your time and your attention. That is not nothing. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the one in the background, the one holding everyone else up, the one whose wins were moved to the back of a shelf, I want you to know that being unseen is not the same as being unworthy. Sometimes the people who truly see you are quieter than the ones who don't. And sometimes they spend 14 years proving it, one small deposit at a time. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it with them. My name is Sarah Mather. I am 34 years old. And the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible inside your own